Welcome, everyone. You know who I am. I'm Deacon Vicki Hanrahan, Assistant to the Bishop for Synodical Life. So thank you for joining us today for an Equipping the Saints webinar. That is our weekly connection with Bishop Rogness and with each other as we walk together in this part of God's kingdom, the South Central Synod of Wisconsin. We will open with prayer, and then Bishop Rogness will give his opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. Throughout the hour, feel free to write your questions and ponderings or share your resources in the chat area, and Bishop Rogness will address those during our conversation. And then at that time, we'll unmute you in case you have a follow-up to the question that you asked. Feel free to put any links to resources in the chat area during the conversation. We are curating those, so we will print out the chat room and I'll include those resources again for you in Connected Community in that issue on Thursday. And then again, also a note, we are recording this webinar. So for anyone who couldn't make it today, or if you just want to go back and revisit anything, those are on the Synod website and you can revisit the recording. So let's take a breath and open with prayer. Eternal, loving God, we thank you for your many blessings, and we thank you for this opportunity to be together, to share our doubts, our fears, our questions, and our ideas in this safe space. Bless our conversation today as we share our best thoughts with each other as we move through this time of pandemic and protests. We are grateful for this group of saints who has joined in today to walk together as we understand that you have built us for community. When one of us grows weak, the other grows strong in order that we may support each other and lift each other up for ministry along the way. And when we have reasons to celebrate, we can praise your name together. So help us to take what we learn here into the world for all of your glory. We ask this in your holy name. Amen.
And
Bishop Rogness, I'll hand it to you.
thanks, Vicki, once again for setting this up and inviting folks into it. And thanks to all the rest of you for joining into the conversation. Here's what I have in mind for us this week. We will, as we have done before, have a good bit of time to talk about the continual journey that we're all in coping with the pandemic, trying to chart life ahead for our parishes and hearing from one another how that's going. I think that's probably the primary benefit of these conversations over the weeks, is just to be able to get a broader frame of reference for how the congregations in our area are dealing with the decisions that we're all facing. So we'll talk some about that. And before we do that, we'll do the same thing here in another minute when I'm done. Just for 6-7 minutes, go into small groups, breakout groups, totally at random, just to be able to check in with one another in a smaller group. And then Robin will simply throw a switch and we'll all be back together again. And most of our time, as I said, we'll talk about the continued journey back into reentry. But then a couple things different. Next week, we're going to do this a little differently. We're switching the time to Wednesday instead of Tuesday for just a one-time thing, and I'll explain why. After the George Floyd killing and all of the upheaval that came from that, we spent a good bit of time in these conversations those next few weeks talking about what the impact of that was in our own congregational life and how we were responding to it, and that was helpful. And I've thought one of the names I hear most in the Madison area, in the South Central Wisconsin area, is Everett Mitchell, an AME pastor in Madison who's been there a number of years. He's also a judge and has spoken to a number of church groups. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with him from one place to another. I've had some conversation with him, and I've invited him to be with us next week. He is in his courtroom on Tuesdays, so we're switching it to Wednesday. But I want to talk a little bit before we're done here today about that conversation and about what ideas may occur to you to make that as helpful a conversation with him as we could do. So we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. And then we have a few announcements, things coming up. There's a little matter of an assembly. There's some news to share about hunger work in our synod. So we'll take a few minutes at the end to talk about those things. But first, let's do breakout groups for, and you don't end up doing a thing. Robin does it all in a minute. When she clicks us, you'll get a note you're going into some breakout group. You'll be in it for, like I say, 6-7 minutes, and then you'll be back out of it, back into this larger group setting. So, Robin, why don't you do whatever it is that you do that I don't have a clue about?
Okay, sounds good. I will do that. Let's just try here. Oh, I think we're in our own breakout room, but hold on, let me see. Let's make sure you get into a breakout room here.
There were a couple of things that I thought, just starting off this general conversation about how things are going, that I was aware of that I thought I wanted to at least interject early into the conversation. One of the things that will be experienced in in congregations as they reopen is what do you do when you reopen and begin to do worship stuff, and then what happens if you discover somebody tests positive. And that happened a week ago. And I think, is Gus on? Gus, are you on this call someplace?
Yes.
Happened to Gus Barnes over in Cuba City. Gus, can you just tell us briefly what happened and how you responded?
Well, immediately we found out on a Friday that she had tested positive at a factory somewhere near Dickeyville, Wisconsin. So immediately that first Sunday, we canceled services. And luckily, that following Wednesday, the city of Platteville was doing testing. So I encouraged everyone to go and be tested. I went and got tested with my spouse, and by Friday, we both found out that we were negative. but only 5 other people tested and were negative and let me know. So as of today's date, I really don't know how many other people bothered to go and get tested. So we closed that week, and I'm closing it this week, sending out another message asking who has been tested, who has not been tested. This is based on my decision as to when we open. You know, if I don't know who's negative, I mean, negative or positive, am I letting people back in a safe environment? So one of the things I would encourage you all to do is talk to your local health department. And if you have any questions, they are more than welcome to help you out. In fact, they actually knew who was the person in my congregation. So once you get tested and you are positive, the state of Wisconsin knows. So call your health departments if you have any questions. So we're going to take one more Sunday off. A small group of us are going back into the church tomorrow to re-wipe everything down again, and hopefully the following weekend some will gather. But it's all dependent on who will bother to respond to me and say whether they've been tested or not. And so in this short time of a pandemic, it's now been my second time being tested, and I've tested negative.
Okay, thanks. I thought it was important just for people's own awareness that that this happens and is going to again.
Or something.
Another question that was raised that got sent to me beforehand. Jamie Reising out in Platteville, intern at First English, raised question about what anybody. Well, Jamie, why don't you pose your question about youth activities during this time?
Yeah, we've been curious, you know, reaching out to youth during this time. Obviously, it's been a big transition for them as well. Gen Zers are a whole different ballgame, and wondering if anybody has reached out, has been successful in doing so, because we haven't been that successful. Also wondering if anybody is using the Discord platform or has interest in using it for youth. Just kind of curious to hear the wisdom that might be out there and success elsewhere in the Synod.
We've been meeting in person with our kids for 2 weeks, I think 3 weeks. We were doing Zoom weekly prior to that, and they were really excited to see everybody. And but then we started meeting in person outside, socially distanced, and because our groups are both 10 or less, and that was prior to phase 2 starting in Sauk County. However, Sauk County's cases have doubled in the last week. And they project they're going to continue to rise as more and more people are tested, obviously. But that's what we've been doing, and the kids have loved it. So just an FYI from Spring Green.
How about outside of in-person gathering? Is anybody having any success or creative ways of doing that? No, you said Zoom, but.
No, that's what we did. We did outside the last 2 weeks. And we did campfires, and so the kids could spread out in the parking lot where they were able to stay 6 feet apart. We also did a service project where we planted plants for our seniors, specifically ones that are living a home alone, homebound, and they were able to spread out to do those as well. So those are a couple of the things we've done.
Nice. Anybody else tried stuff with young people?
Jamie, we have out in Fort Atkinson, we have done a few things. We have found, because of the way in which our school district chose to do their online learning, which required probably 3 to 4 hours a day of Zoom meetings for our students, that when they came for a Zoom church anything, they were just dead. They were totally not interested at all. They loved seeing each other, and we had a lot more success. I've had success one-on-one with my confirmation students, and our youth director has had success one-on-one with our high school students. But at this time, you know, they're just coming off all of that online education. As for Discord, you know what? I hadn't even thought of that. That is really a good idea. I can see that being very useful. So thanks for the idea.
I'll play the non-current card. Can someone explain what Discord platform is?
Not really. It's just another social media platform. Jamie?
Yeah, it's a newer social media platform that we're actually just learning about at First English as well. And I actually have a 13-year-old and asked him about it. And he was like, oh yeah, they use that. My friend used that. But you can do video chat, just normal chatting. You can play games together.
Yeah.
You know, study groups. You can. It is really. I encourage you to Google it and Google church alongside it and the guides that go along with some of these evangelical congregations. It's very interesting, and it is a very interesting platform that I'm sure will gain popularity.
That and Slack.
Oh, we don't know about Slack.
So
All right.
my children will have to help me.
So how about the rest of you? What are what have you been experiencing in the last week or two that might be interesting for the rest of us to hear about? That any recent decisions in the last week or so about moving forward, when to reopen, how to reopen?
We have a couple of weddings coming up, and we have a wedding book that we give out that has a listed total from pre-COVID. So we had to talk to brides specifically about, and brides were not happy, couples were not happy with, you know, saying, hey, you can have 18 people in service. So we're moving a little bit up. I think 25% of our capacity is 65. I don't like to be at capacity, even the reduced capacity. So we're going to do, I think we said 50 in the sanctuary, really spread out, still no singing, no communion. And we're doing overflow in the banquet hall, overflow seating, and we're doing closed circuit television. So that was our solution to that.
I'm curious, just in terms of general spread of experiences, let me ask if you have go away, Robin, go away from highlighting the speaker, and I'm going to ask just how many of you are doing something in-person worship, and how many of you are still in a holding off from in-person worship mode. So make your hand really visible when I pose whichever category you're in. How many of you are now doing some sort of weekly in-person worship? How many? Okay. And how many of you are still in your congregation, still holding off from weekly in-person worship? Okay, that looks to me like a few more are holding off than are into it. So what that says to me is that we're still very cautious in figuring out how and when to move into this, but bit by bit it's happening. Those of you who have held off that are not yet entering in-person worship, have you had conversations, some of you had conversations about thinking about when, how far down the road, or what threshold has to be crossed before you decide to do that? Yeah, Tim?
So yeah, we were meeting with our opening team on Thursday. We met on Monday, and then we're going to meet on Thursday. We just put a survey out asking the congregation if they want to have indoor service. Surprisingly, about 75% have said no, they're going to stay home and do online, which we will continue. But I think we're still working on having some sort of in-person worship for those few. We're a smaller congregation, so we're talking 20 or 30, no more than 40 in our area that can seat 200. So I think we can do a really good job of spreading people out. And we haven't made a decision when we're going to open. And the key for us is with few people wanting to have, or few people that do want to worship, are we going to be able to get the volunteers that we need to clean before and after, to have ushers, to have people guiding people in? Those are the challenges that we're facing.
Interesting. And you had, I think you mentioned and we shared with others the survey that you had done, which I think prompted a number of other congregations to do a similar thing, just to get a sense more widely of people that have been doing that. Others of you that are not doing it yet, but maybe are having some conversation about how or when or what threshold needs to be met.
Well, we're
go
doing
ahead.
drive-in worship, and we have been, like I've shared, since March 29th. And so we have no incentive to go inside. So I think that's my question on those who are doing drive-in. That's a totally different animal, I think, for folks, because our folks don't want to go inside and they don't see the reason to, because we can do that. And so I guess we're really, really fortunate. And so that's why I asked the question about how many other, those people who are doing drive-in, kind of what's their incentive or what's their plan.
Anybody got a response to that? If you're currently doing drive-in, and that seems to be going pretty well, and I think quite a few, I think there are a number of drive-in models happening around the Synod. Any thought about what would move you inside? Outside of really cold weather, I suppose. Other observations. It's much of the in our small group. There was after talking about, well, we're making this decision, but frankly, I'm tired of making all these decisions, and I'm not sure I'm making the right ones anyway. I think there's an element of just plain getting fatigued by the whole business, and one of my responses all along is to say, don't beat up on yourself over somehow trying to make sure you get it right. I think exercising caution and safety, that's real important. What shape that takes in whatever decision you make is going to vary from place to place. Some of you are dealing with congregations that are full of people highly motivated to get back together, almost insistent of finding some way to get back together. Others of you serve congregations where the mindset is pretty content to just ride it out for a while and say what we're doing is fine. And I think that's a really good thing.
I want to thank you, Bishop. Last week, you and I spoke as we were getting ready out here to do what we call the dry run of worship. I had been meeting with a task force group that put some modifications in place, and we invited the council in to be the guinea pigs for worship. And before even getting to this modified worship format, council members were really upset, really had a lot of negative rhetoric, things like, well, no church of mine is gonna do X, Y, Z. And I felt incredibly vulnerable. And so I reached out and had some good support from both Robin and the bishop. But, you know, I would recommend to anybody else who may have that kind of mix on your council, which is probably all of us, that you try something like that, because it really helped our council being in the same room together and hearing explanations and having some conversation. And by the time we were done, everyone was on board with every modification. Sign up for worship, masks, well, encouraging masks, I think is how we'll have to phrase that. But it was really helpful. So it was an important step for us. So thank you again.
Let me say a little bit more about that, because I think the situation Amy found herself in is can be an instructive kind of a case study for handling some of the dynamics that may be present in other places too. Amy called and said she had asked her council to form a task force to talk about reentry, and they weren't real hot on doing that. So she took the initiative and asked some people to form a task force. Several council members, as I recall, then agreed to serve on that. And this group came up with what seemed like a pretty responsible plan for a safe plan, cautious plan, emphasizing safety, and they were going to try a dry run. And that's when all of a sudden several loud voices insistent that this kind of no church of mine is going to do this. There's no point. And as Amy and I talked about it, I think it became clear really what she was experiencing was bullying behavior from some in her congregations. and the thing to and once you identify it as that type of behavior, then you recognize you don't move forward in a healthy way by giving in to bullying behavior. You recognize it for what it is. And frame it as though if they are not willing to go along with these guidelines that have been put together by people representing the good of the church, that's their choice. They can make their choice to not come. But if you do come, this is the way we're going to gather. They may choose to not come for that reason. Frankly, on the other end of the spectrum, there will be some that'll choose not to come because even that gathering is a risk level they don't want to take. So you may end up with people on both sides, but you don't cave into one side or the other just because they're loud and insistent. So I think Amy did a nice job of empowering the people who had come together and said, this is our plan, and didn't give in to the what I thought sounded like bullying behavior. So you did that well, Amy.
Yeah, and I wanted to add too, Amy brought up something, this sounds like the Amy show. Sorry, Amy, if we're embarrassing you.
Listen, my ministry has a lot of learning points from it, and we all know it. So learn away, my friends.
I really appreciated, though, in our breakout group where you talked a little bit about the language that you're using in your congregation, that, you know, as a synod communicator, words are important, and how you frame things up and present them can really make a difference. And the language that you're using is regathering, not reopening, signing up versus making a reservation for worship. I think that's important. And you're making modifications. You're not making restrictions. So I liked the way you're framing up the way you're doing things in your congregation. I think it's important to pay attention to that.
In terms of that question of bullying, Bishop, our oldest daughter is a pastor in the Northern Illinois Synod, and her church recently voted to open up worship again, and they're not going to wear masks. They're going to sing, they're going to have communion, and they're not going to clean afterwards. And that her congregation, the pastor has no vote on this council, so she feels a bit bullied by it. The bishop sent, I think in that synod, sent out something to all the pastors, and his concern was that he's noticed that most of the congregations in his synod who are behaving like that have women pastors, that women pastors are being bullied more. And I'm wondering if that's, you know, I'm not surprised by that, but is that a pattern in this synod?
Well, that's a good question. I'd be interested in people's observation about that. I think it tends to be, test me on this, one reaction I would have is, I think it tends to be more rural congregations than urban congregations where that's in evidence. And it would not surprise me if if that hypothesis that somehow women are seen by people who do bullying as easier targets for bullying than men are. You know,
Well,
it certainly fit with the culture, I think.
almost all of her classmates were sent to rural congregations, most of her female classmates.
Yeah, well, yeah. Other observations about that? Interesting point. And it also, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I find that to be the case in this call. You know, I've made some really deliberate choices about my leadership here because it is time for this congregation to really have the lay people be empowered. So there are times when I won't step in, you know, they can figure that out and they'll do it. But I have noticed that they need a few more boundaries. Otherwise, they do become bullying to one another and sometimes to me. And we don't have time for that. You know, there's just not room for it.
Well, it's a tough situation when if a congregation, as Eric, as you were citing the example, a congregation simply decides we're charging ahead, and in the pastor's judgment, probably others of us as well would say they're not doing it wisely. And if the pastor disagrees with that, then what's the pastor's appropriate response? Especially, and what can make it even more complicated is, what if the pastor is 64 years old, has diabetes or heart issues, or has, you know, other health issues where the health guidelines themselves say not only don't lead the service, but don't go to settings like that. We've had one of those situations where a pastor has simply had to say, I won't do that. And that could get it into a nasty confrontation. It didn't in that case, but it could. I mean, that's some of the difficult times we're in.
Kirsten, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, one of the things that's causing pressure in my context is that both the Catholic churches in Spring Green and Plain have opened up, and they're doing service the way they've always done it, singing and everything. And so people in the community then are pressuring our church to begin services as well. Thankfully, the Spring Green Community Church, which is evangelical, they are doing church, but they're doing it outdoors and they're socially distancing, so at least providing a model that's safer than what I thought. But what I found to be helpful is we did a congregational survey. We did a task force, which this week, the task force decided, I kind of tried to stay back and just facilitate that. They decided that they didn't feel comfortable with our congregation meeting at this time at all, to continue what we've been doing, which is online, and because our survey results supported that. So, and so that's the recommendation that's going to be given to the council this Thursday. Whether or not they decide they're not okay with that, I don't know at this point, but it was good for the task force to own that decision and for them to be the ones that are behind it, as opposed to it coming from me.
Nice, good. Let me address a couple things that are coming that have been posted in the chat room. One question that has Kirsten asked, has anyone checked with Church Mutual in regards to coverage? Nancy Robbie responded, we just moved to Church Mutual. I asked, they said they have no coverage for viruses or bacteria. I'm confused by that. That's not consistent with my understanding. In fact, somebody then, I think, posted, are we liable if it's traced back to our worship service? And the answer I've received out of the General Counsel's office of the ELCA is that you are not liable unless it can be, two things are the case. One is, can it be absolutely proven they caught it from your worship service? And the answer to that is, that's really hard to prove. And secondly, even if they did say the likelihood is that somebody caught it in your worship service, if you were not doing things contrary to published health department guidelines, that is, if you're doing mask and distancing and that sort of thing, you simply wouldn't be held liable. And one other piece of information, if you go to Church Mutual's website, they have now posted a piece that is guidance for safe gathering. I haven't watched it, but someone who has told me about it said it's very similar to what you're hearing from all the other, everything from the ELCA's website to the Council of Churches to CDC and so on. It's the same sort of thing, but this one is, Church Mutuals is specifically aimed, as the ELCA guidelines are, of course, at churches and reducing risk in the church setting. So that may be, I haven't looked at, as I say, I haven't looked at that. I like what was posted from Lutheran Memorial Church. If they have masks available, they want them to use it. And if somebody shows up and will not put one on, they then seat them at least 12 feet from others. I'm curious, to Lutheran Memorial, do you have many people that come and refuse and therefore sit 12 feet from others?
Well, we haven't even started yet. We're going to have our first trial run with council who are willing to come on this Sunday. So we'll see. But we have a food pantry as well, and so that's one of the tactics we're going to use there, is to make sure that people who are not wearing masks are directed to stay 12 feet away from each other. But the other thing I would just mention, since I have the floor, if a church is having difficulty implementing strategies to have a safe congregation experience, I would suggest that you get in touch with your health department and have them review your plan, because they surely will be able to person for you and can give advice. And surely if you go contrary to the health department, you are in pretty big trouble, because the health department is the public health authority in the state of Wisconsin at the local level.
There are two other questions in the chat. One has to do with unemployment. Michelle asks, when a staff person is let go, rules were changed with COVID-19. The one thing that I know was changed in that is that because churches do not pay into state unemployment programs, employees who are let go are not eligible to collect unemployment, and that's what was changed in COVID. So in the pandemic time. So I think my understanding is that church employees who are let go are eligible for unemployment. I've not heard a specific story of that. I haven't heard that story yet of an instance of that happening. Maybe some of you have. Let's see, what else is there? I'm watching our time. I think someone made reference to an elderly doctor on CNN as harming young people. Haven't heard that. Anyway, I'm going to switch gears just quickly to say a little bit more about next week. I mentioned at the beginning of this session that I've asked Everett Mitchell to join us for next week's conversation, and because of that, it's going to be on Tuesday and on Wednesday and not Tuesday. But But in the conversation that I had about him, I posed the question and then he changed it a bit. So here's how that went. I said, I thought it would be helpful to, since he knows South Central Wisconsin, he knows church life, he's not unfamiliar with Lutherans. I said, so we're dealing with a synod whose congregations are 96% white, latest statistics. 96% white, many of the congregations all white, many of them very rural. What would he, as an African-American pastor located in our part of the world, what would he like to see his brothers and sisters who are pastors of ELCA Lutheran congregations, white congregations, what would he like to see us doing in our congregations? That was the way I posed the question. He turned it around a little and he said, well, I could talk a lot. I could give a kind of a generic talk about race and how we have to deal with it. But he said, I think I would much rather spend our time dealing with real hard questions that don't have simple answers, that are more pointed than just a sort of a general survey of the topic. I'd like to hear what I'd like us to deal together with the harder questions, the ones that may make us uncomfortable in the asking or in the answering, the hearing. And he said, and I'd like you and your people to think about what those questions would be. So I've tossed that out to a few people. I've tossed that out to some folks on our racial equity team. I've tossed it out to others. And now I'm tossing it out here. And I've said, so what are the questions that are tough for you, that are hard for you to deal with, or maybe hard for your people to deal with, that it might be helpful to hear him reflect with us about that. And here's your turnaround time. You got about 24 hours to think about this, because I'm going to talk to him again tomorrow afternoon. I'm going to send him by tomorrow afternoon a list of proposed questions, and then he and I are going to have a phone conversation about it on Friday to tee that up then for what is he going to address on Wednesday. And then next Wednesday in this meeting, the format will be a little bit like my interviewing him, but I'm going to be interviewing him with questions that have arisen from within the synod. So if you think of some questions that that you would like to have as part of that discussion, I invite you to email them to me in the next 24 hours. Then a couple other things we wanted to do in addition to just the quick announcements. You've all gotten assembly information and registrations are, I think Vicki said last, we're over 100 already for the early registrations that are coming in. That's good. Cheaper to get it in now than you save $5 if you get it in before the end of the month.
That's right.
But here's an announcement we wanted to take a little bit of time for. One of the things I learned early this year, before we shut down, just after the first of the year, I had a conversation with Dan Rift, who stopped by our office. Dan had been for a number of years the head of the ELCA's hunger program. I learned that the South Central Synod, I learned two things about it. Number one, the South Central Synod didn't have per se a world hunger group that just kind of worked on hunger issues. And number two, the South Central Synod of Wisconsin is the highest per capita contributor to the ELCA's hunger fund of all the synods. So there's been great response from this synod with sort of very little infrastructure, but Walter Barris then convened a few people to say we really ought to have a group that becomes an advocate for this and works on it. So we invited a few people to come together to take that on, and so I'm going to call on Ramey Bach and Ramey and Eric. We're very active in this. Up until years ago, they were up in the Northwest Synod of Wisconsin. We're active up there in this. I do want to mention that one other person who was at that beginning meeting, well, I'll say that in a minute. Go ahead, Ramey, why don't you talk a bit about what your committee's up to and what would be helpful from the Synod more widely.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you, Bishop. I got it ready in the chat just in case we ran out of time. So everything is right there too. This is just a quick commercial to say that our team is just new and we're trying to get ourselves going. We've created a mission statement of sorts to guide our work for these first months and year. And we're looking for more people to be a point of contact between team members and the congregations in our synod. And we had the idea that it would be a good idea to have either one volunteer from each conference on the World Hunger Team, or at least to have someone be a point of contact between the team and all of the conferences. And so we're looking for some volunteers, and I see Tim's already volunteered here, but if you need to think about that or talk about that in your conference and let us know, you can just email Walter. I put down who's on the team right now. It's myself, Walter, Fred, Amy, and Eric. And I guess I'll leave it up to them if they want to chime in on anything else that I missed.
Yeah, Ramey, I add to the list that, or add to the process that there's a lot of really exciting, interesting things that are being done in different congregations. And sometimes those stories don't get told very well or get spread beyond their doors. And so to be able to be in contact with the folks to find the best ideas and share them, I think would advance our standing as the per capita leader without having a committee advancing world hunger needs.
Good, thanks, Fred. Yeah, that really is, that did strike me as a real testimony to the number of people in this synod that have a real heart for going after this. The little postscript I wanted to add was that one other person who was at that initial organizing meeting when Walter threw out the invitation, are you interested in coming to this, was Joe Brosius over at Good Shepherd, who is, many of you know Joe, involved in the Holy Cow ministry as well. But Joe showed up, he was ready to go for this, and then Joe suffered a really debilitating stroke from which he is still making his way back in therapy. So a great heart, a great passion for this kind of work in ministry, and keep him in your prayers because he's making progress, but it's got a ways to go. Vicki, what other
One last word on this, Bishop. I just wonder if we were leading this country in giving as a synod, is the best thing to do to form a committee?
Well, I'd like to say it can't hurt, but let's say just make sure the committee doesn't get in the way, No, I'm sure it can't hurt. Can't hurt. And maybe one of the best functions of that committee, as you form a network like you're seeking to do, is just what Fred talked about, and that is lift up the stories of how people are making this work and work well in this synod, because a good number of people must be doing good stuff for us to be in that position.
Good point.
Vicki, let me toss it to you for some closing announcements and things.
I mean, those were our important announcements today. You mentioned Synod Assembly registration. Get your voting members registered because the early bird registration closes at the end of the month. So get them in there. And it's also going to help us this year because after everybody's registered, we will start figuring out where people will be assigned to their particular site. So if you are a host site, you should know that by now, but we are sending out communications today to all the host sites that you will be invited to an informational meeting that's happening on July 1st from 7 to 8 p.m. And then you'll also be invited to a dry run. Just so you know, everyone who is hosting as a remote site, your people will be obviously voting from your own location. So that's one of the benefits. You don't have to travel very far. Nobody's going to have to travel very far to Synod Assembly this year. It'll all be a comfortable driving distance. You know, just make sure you're diligent and get your people registered for Synod Assembly. That's it. I had no more on.
And
Yes?
if you're wondering why, if we know who the sites are, why aren't we publicizing that? I just learned this when clarified it with Vicki just the other day, and that is until we're absolutely sure that all the technology is tried and working well, and where the registrations are coming from, then we'll do the here are the sites and here's where your group is assigned. But as Vicki says, it's not going to be very far.
Right, right. Somebody just asked the time of the webinar with Bishop and Everett Mitchell. It's next Wednesday at 2 p.m. And we will publish that link. Robin will give me the link this time, and we'll publish it in What Matters so that you can all have access to that. And we'll publish it in Connected Community as well. All right.
Good.
Well, thanks again unless you have any final comments, Bishop, we'll close it off.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I find these good conversations week after week. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone. It's always better with you here. Have a great day. God bless.